Putin is trying to nurture a sense of nostalgia for that period and overlook the more negative aspects of that period. So even when we mark the 50th anniversary of Stalin's death in 2003, there was no official statement about the victims of Stalin.
But I think there's also a question of pride. Many of them feel, well, we used to be a great country. Now we're not a great country. But we don't want to hear anything bad about when we were a great country. We would like to maintain the illusion that it was a good system. They don't want to disturb that image, and they don't want to disturb that memory.
This impenetrable land, this riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, as Churchill famously categorized it. This extraordinary state of mind, equally unconquerable and inexplicable. This is Mother Russia on the brink of a new era in the 21st century. Will she, however, acknowledge her dark past? Russia, late in the first decade of the 21st century, has recently passed through another revolution, following the openness to change in glasnost and perestroika in the 1990s. It was all about making sure it would never happen again. It was edifying to some, for a time, but did the Russian government ever really sign on? Fear grows that the current government now would prefer to see a certain moral amnesia reimposed on Russia's collective memory, shunting aside lingering remorse over such painful experiences as the infamous persecutions of the 50-year Gulag experience. It would be a matter of convenience, better for business, better for the political order, better for those who find guilt cumbersome, better for the determined drive to make glorious Mother Russia again what she rightfully ought to be, a giant among nations. That has been the government agenda. There is neither time nor place for remorse, for any return to the Gulag era. A Russian history scholar, Joshua Rubinstein, is regional director of Amnesty International in Boston.
Stalin's forced labor camp system, the Gulag, was one of the worst examples of human rights violations of the 20th century. First in scale, that it engulfed millions of people, that it was a significant part of the Soviet economy, that it left a terrible legacy that took decades and decades to overcome.
Professor Mark Kramer, specialist in Cold War studies at Harvard's Davis Center, lost 27 members of his family from Riga, Latvia, and knows the power of the Gulag to engulf the citizens of Russia and its satellites.
The Gulag is a combination, contraction, and acronym of a Russian term. It's Главное управление исправительно-трудовых лагерей колоний. Forced labor camps would have been perhaps more accurate. But this term became equivalent over time with the whole penal system, this whole enormous, sprawling system of camps and colonies in which both criminals and political prisoners were incarcerated.
Anne Applebaum is the author of the definitive work on the history of the Gulag.
There were Gulag camps really from the very beginning of the Soviet Union. Lenin and Trotsky founded the first camps in 1918, and they were a very important part of Soviet policy in the 1920s. But in 1929, Stalin launched the first real industrialization of the camp system. In other words, he began to see that the Gulag could play an important function in the Soviet economy. And he expanded their numbers, and he expanded what they did. So they were no longer just a few little logging camps. They were chemical factories, and they used prisoners to open up mining districts, and they used prisoners to build roads and railroads and so on. And this system of mass forced labor through which millions of people passed lasted from about 1929 until Stalin's death in 1953. And at that point, it was not ended, but it was dismantled as a production system.
Marshall Goldman, senior scholar at Harvard's Davis Center, has studied closely the economic development of Russia.
Well, for a time, Stalin, when he particularly began to promote and increase the gulags, the camps, he was doing it in part for economic reasons, because he was sending people up into the far north, places that up until then were not attracting workers on their own. And so for a while, he was developing metals industry and timber, and they thought that this would pay for itself. Other subsequent calculations have found that financially it was not a profit-making operation. But in the beginning, for sure, there was the notion that we could use this free labor to develop resources which would have a value for industry and even for the export sector.
The camps, later focusing on punitive measures, then extended into Eastern Europe during the Iron Curtain era after World War II. They were reinvented as work farms and as detention centers for political dissenters in the 1960s and 1970s, like Anatoly Shransky and Nobel Peace Prize activist Andrei Sakharov. And the camps lingered on in dwindling numbers and intensity until Mikhail Gorbachev, the grandson of an egregiously wronged Gulag victim, pardoned the last political dissenters and closed the remaining penal colonies in 1987. While the camp gates have closed, the history annals are opening. Yet throughout this tragic period, as is the case with all of the Gulag's vital statistics, there is no official count. But it is believed there were close to 500 distinct camp complexes in the Soviet Union alone, consisting of thousands of individual stations, pockets of despair scattered in Russia's most forlorn wastes. Nina Khrushcheva, the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, notes the irrelevance of the individual in a larger collective enterprise like the Soviet state.
Forced labor was an important thing. Stalin was a great leader for the Soviet Union at the time because he made it a great nation. And so, yes, well, a couple of millions got killed in the process, but so what? Since Russian system, or the Kremlin, or whatever the power structure is never any respect for an individual human life. I mean, we really do count people by the millions. So a million here, a million there really didn't make that much of a difference.
But during Stalin's reign, in short order, the all-powerful dictator twisted the concept of economic reform to make it serve his own soaring paranoia, obliterating every shred of dissent. So the camps proliferated in the mid-30s, bulging with political prisoners and the merely luckless, and soon multiplied 12-fold. And then came the Great Terror of 1937 to 38, when 1 of every 20 people in the Soviet Union was arrested. Those who were not executed were condemned to a hellish existence in the Gulag. Besides the starvation and exhausting labor that accounted for most of the deaths, countless prisoners were executed.
In the period of just 1937-38 alone, there were over 700,000 shot in that 1 year. 1 year, you think about that, that was in the lead up to World War II, and they need people to be able to help defend the country, and instead they kill close to 1 million of them. The total number shot during the Stalin period was probably about 1.5 million.
It's very difficult to talk about precise numbers. We know that between 1929, when Stalin first began to expand the camps, and 1953, when Stalin died, that about 18 million people passed through them, which was about 15% of the Soviet population.
It took on massive scales after Stalin consolidated power. So it was an extraordinary quarter century of violence and persecution. And the fact that it engulfed whole categories of people, not only the obvious political opponents of the regime within the communist movement or political movements per se, but religious believers, writers, people are accused of undermining the economy, people accused of subversion of different types, often falsely accused, of course.
The Gulag went through different phases. There were phases when the commanders were more interested in economic production, and because they were interested in that, they tried to treat prisoners relatively well in order to get them to produce more. There were also phases, notably at the height of the Great Terror in 1937-38, when the Gulag became harsher and crueler, and the commanders became less interested in production and minded less when more people died.
Millions were sent into exile, consigned to Eastern European camps after World War II. All were simply executed. Most historians regard the accepted semi-official numbers as mere minimums, while Alexander Solzhenitsyn, sentenced to 8 years of hard labor, put a human face on the tragedy for the West in his personal and collective history, Gulag Archipelago.
Relatively little was known about the Gulag outside the Soviet Union. Even within the Soviet Union, the term Gulag was almost never used. That changed in 1961 with the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was published with official permission in the Soviet Union.
This took the country by storm, and it opened a floodgate of manuscripts coming into publishing houses. Very few, if any, were actually officially published in the Soviet Union, and pretty soon the regime grew wary and apprehensive of this kind of literature, and it wasn't permitted. His subsequent books about the Gulag, his novels Cancer Ward, First Circle, were not published in the Soviet Union.
So his monumental work, the Gulag Archipelago, which appeared in the West in the mid-1970s, that came out strictly in the outside world, not within the Soviet Union. The impact of this book is hard to overstate because there were still illusions in the West at that time that somehow the Soviet Union may have had a bad period during the Stalin era, but it was basically moving in the right direction.
But there's no question that Solzhenitsyn played a principal role, not only in initiating this literature inside the Soviet Union, even if it couldn't be circulated freely, but alerting the West to the scale of this repression.
The West was thus awakened in the 70s to the continuing horrors of the labor camps. Into this litany of statistics and collective tragedies comes the individual. The cruelty and crime visited upon Russian citizens was monumental. In his monstrous paranoia, Stalin grimly cast a dark shadow over his own people.
There seemed to have been a quota at different times that the police in different communities simply had to arrest so many people. And so this was not only a form of intimidation of the population, which I think was its primary purpose, but it also reflected a certain paranoia on the part of Stalin that if he knew there were certain obvious opponents in a city or in a community, he would arrest 100 to make sure he got those 3 people.
The intrigues were endless, usually beginning with a whisper, a suspicion, an errant comment, a note, a touch of treachery, even a foolish prank, leading suddenly to an arrest.
Almost anybody at any time knew there could be a knock on the door in the middle of the night and they could be taken away. And in fact, at the height of certain waves of terror in the late 30s and again in 1948, there were many people who feared arrest who simply kept a little packed bag by their beds because they knew that, if somebody came to the door to take them to prison, they'd want to have certain things with them. They'd want to have a change of clothes. They'd want to have a little bit of money. They'd want to have some soap, things like that. So it was a very prevalent fear.
Anyone and everyone could be snared in this dragnet. A clergyman, a politician, a businessman or thief, a naive student carried away with his own bombast, a pathetic peasant of absolutely no power or influence. Everyone was vulnerable. The government was truly a ministry of fear.
The appearance of legality was terribly important to the Russian state. There were trials held, even if they were 1-minute trials or 30-second trials. Every prisoner had a trial and every prisoner was sentenced. This was part of the way in which the Gulag was justified to the people who were charged with carrying it out. Every guard was told, these prisoners are criminals, they've had a trial, they're enemies of the people, it's been proved.
And then came what may have been the worst ordeal of the entire experience, the transport by train to one's penal destination, from Moscow to the Arctic Circle, or some parched Siberian wasteland, or barren Kazakhstan, or the far, far east, 10 time zones distant, in the remote corner of the Soviet Union. The experience of getting there was usually horrific.
Prisoners were put into cattle cars, often with nothing. It would just simply be an empty car, handed a loaf of bread, and effectively told that's all they were going to get for a week or for 2 weeks. Doors were shut, and the guards would have no further communication with the prisoners during the trip. So these trains became terrible death traps. In the summer, they were incredibly hot. In the winter, they were incredibly cold. Prisoners literally died of thirst. They fought with one another. They murdered one another inside these cars. There were no toilets, obviously, so the stench was unbearable.
The gold mines of Kolyma are silent now. Called the Land of White Death, the ruins of Kolyma cannot recount the damage done to millions of Russian souls and bodies. It could be called the Auschwitz of the Soviet Union. Stalin's interest in the region was keen. Production was monitored closely. Conditions were horrible.
The worst place of all in reputation among Gulag prisoners, as well as in general by those who had escaped from the Gulag, was Kolyma, which is in the area now known as Magadan. It's one of the coldest areas in which people have ever lived, but the people who were brought there were not living there voluntarily. No one would endure those types of temperatures. You're talking about 60 below zero, 70 below zero at times. And the idea of putting the camp there was in part to be able to exploit the gold, mineral, and other resources in that area.
So high was the attrition, a highway built by the laborers at Kolyma became known as the Road of Bones. A poet and survivor of Kolyma, Yuri Lvovich Fiddlegoltz, talks about the harshness of these conditions at Kolyma and other locales in the remote area of Magadan.
After Ozirlag, they transferred me to Kolyma. I met there a doctor who managed to stay there at a medical station, avoiding transportation further up north. The doctor saved my life, taking me as an assistant, although I had no medical education at all. I spent about 2 or 3 months at the transfer camp in Magadan. Magadan was a deadly place, a most scary place for me. All works there were hard manual labor, and considering prisoners' weak health condition, it was impossible to fulfill our daily job quotas. I got thin very quickly, or, using the camp slang, turned into a daha jaga, one walking the last steps to the end. I was not able to do anything at all. Death was waiting for me. However, I preferred to die at the punishment block rather than die at work as a slave. That is why I refused to work. That is how I became an Otkazchik, a prisoner refusing to work.
Eventually, Fiddlegoltz was freed and returned to Moscow, afflicted with a serious case of tuberculosis, brought on by his physical ordeals in the frigid regions of Magadan. It was in the Gulag short story collection, Kolyma Tales, that poet-survivor Varlam Shalamov fittingly states, "A human being survives by his ability to forget." Mikhail Rogachev works for Repentance, a Russian organization which researches records and documents the fate of prisoners, particularly in Komi.
Смотря что считать пытками, специально их не пытали.
The prisoners were not tortured on purpose, but they were subject to constant cold, hunger, and hazing by the guards.
Это разве не пытки?
It was completely permissible to kill a prisoner with no punishment for it, just by claiming he was trying to escape. You could put them in cold incarceration, and this was not considered torture.
Полами с бетонными стенами.
This is a room with a concrete floor, concrete walls, and no heating.
Когда
And this is where the temperatures reach 30 or 40 degrees below Celsius. That is torture.
The fabled White Sea Canal project, dearest of all to Stalin's black heart, was its own type of death camp. Slave laborers worked with primitive tools in abominable conditions to construct 141 miles of waterways with 19 locks. It was to have been Stalin's masterpiece.
There had been proposals to build a canal from the White Sea to connect to the Baltic Sea for many, many years. This went back far before the Soviet regime, almost to the time of Peter the Great. What was different in the early 1930s when this was done is that Stalin was willing to commit the resources and the human lives to do it. So this canal was completed in 1933 using prisoners from the newly formed Gulag. You're talking at the height there were more than 100,000 prisoners working on this canal.
But it didn't work, which surprised few experts. It was insufficiently deep or wide and was frozen over for 6 months of the year. At least 25,000 workers died on the project, which in the end proved to be nothing more than a colossal waste of time and especially of lives. Evgenia Kaidarova works on human rights issues in the region of Komi.
Работа была весь световой день.
Work went throughout the daylight hours. In the morning, they ate balanda, a type of gruel. And if they had fulfilled their quota, they received 400 grams of bread. They weren't fed any dinner, so they would drink the gruel, or stash the bread, or divide it, and keep a part of it for dinner. And for supper, after they had worked 12 to 14 hours, there was again a thin gruel.
It was a matter of luck where you landed, but no matter where you were or when, if you resisted or protested or fought back, you were in trouble. Solitary confinement was the least of the censures, and it was none too pleasant. Vladimir Osipov, a Gulag survivor, knew this firsthand.
There were concrete walls, essentially concrete floors, covered only with planks. It was horribly cold. You'd be in your underwear and undershirt. There was nowhere to take shelter. You'd tremble from the cold. That was the way the KGB and bosses of the camp would act.
Very early on, the Soviet secret police made a decision to mix criminal and political prisoners. That meant that the camps were in effect run by the criminal prisoners. You know, there would be a mafia boss at the camp, and he would have people who did his bidding, and sometimes literally by murder and rape, they would control the other prisoners.
Leonid Borodin found himself in several prisons and camps because he saw the light following Stalin's death.
Инакомыслящим, если говорить об инакомыслии, я осознал себя намного позднее того, как это случилось.
Becoming a dissenter, I didn't recognize it until it happened. Our reality in those times, the 60s and late 50s, it gave a lot of reasons to ponder and to doubt. And the deciding factor here was the 20th Party Congress, with its denouncement of the cult of personality. I grew up surrounded by love for Stalin. I was a loyal and dedicated pioneer and member of the Komsomol. I believed myself to be living in the happiest country in the world and the most just country, where injustice did not exist and where everyone got exactly what they deserve. The 20th Party Congress, with the denouncement of Stalin, the idol of my childhood, came as a great shock to me. It forced me to reevaluate my reality, and that reevaluation propelled me into dissent.
Some unfortunate individuals found themselves in some remote camp for their religious beliefs alone. Joseph Stalin and his government wanted no competition, be it from God or any internationally connected religion.
In Stalin's mind and in the ideology he was promoting, religion was the opium of the people, to echo Marx's famous phrase. And it perhaps served as an alternate ideology to the state. And it gave people an alternate sense of loyalty to something beyond the state. And of course, in religion at its best, nurtures a sense of personal conscience. And the regime was trying to destroy that, to squash that.
In Stalin's world, all religions were enemies of the state, with the Christian Orthodox at the top of their list. Right behind, surprisingly, were the Jehovah's Witnesses, a relatively new sect hardly steeped in power. The Witnesses nonetheless gave the regime major concern with their staunch allegiance to their beliefs and dignified acceptance of the consequences. One would not realize this history of severe persecution in the Jehovah's Witnesses Pastoral Center outside of St. Petersburg. Yet Vasily Kalin and Nikolai Dubovinsky can testify to the hardship they suffered for their faith. The family of Vasily Kalin was offered amnesty if they would renounce their faith. They refused.
Of course, at this point there was nothing else to do but carry out the orders. They were given 2 hours to gather their things. There was a thorough search. They took away all our literature, and like all the others, we ended up in Siberia.
For 6 months, they investigated me. They questioned me at everything. The materials I had with me they brought into evidence. And in August of 1957, I was put on trial. I was sentenced to execution. There were 2 of us, no, 4 of us, who were sentenced to capital punishment, and then it was commuted to 25 years.
All of that for declining to renounce one's faith. Viktor Chevyaku, now living in Vancouver, British Columbia, managed to escape this pressure on the Jehovah's Witnesses. He relived the persecution of his family while visiting the Gulag exhibition at Boston University.
There was nothing not to like about them as about people, because they were hardworking, honest people. They got along with their neighbors well. But the Soviet government had an intention to establish the worldwide communism, and Jehovah's Witnesses were preaching about worldwide kingdom of God, heavenly kingdom, and the idea of heavenly kingdom did not fit the Soviet ideology. Therefore, Jehovah's Witnesses unwillingly became ideological enemies of the Soviet regime.
On the other end of the religious spectrum was a Roman Catholic priest. Father Walter Chisek was a Jesuit missionary arrested in Russia in 1941 as a Vatican spy. He was imprisoned and tortured for 5 years in the infamous Lubyanka prison, where Russians sarcastically joked that Lubyanka had the best view in Moscow, since from it you could see all the way to Siberia. Father Richard Blake is a Jesuit from the New York province, where Father Chisek spent his last 2 decades of freedom before his death in 1984.
His mission in 1937 was to find out the condition of the Catholics who were further into the Soviet Union, in the Ukraine and the Soviet Union. But that was enough for the government to give him a 16-year jail sentence in the gulags, the work camps.
In the camps near the Arctic Circle, Father Chisek continued his ministry, living with threats all the time.
I was in a place where I was always threatened. didn't have to threaten me. I was there in such a place that any moment they'd call you out and shoot you. And I thought I was going to be shot. I mean, I was under that impression. That's what they insinuated.
Well, he was an ordinary laboring man. He worked in the labor camps. That was part of his disguise, was that he was just an ordinary worker, but he had some extraordinary adventures in trying to minister to people in terrible conditions, trying to serve and minister to the people that were there. The story was that he would never be allowed to leave the country because he knew too much about the prison camps and interrogation techniques. The Soviet government released a statement that he had died, and it was only later, when he was able to smuggle some documents out, that the family realized that he was still alive, and the United States government went to work on it and tried to get an exchange of prisoners, which they did in 1963. So 2 convicted Soviet spies in the U.S. Were sent back to Russia, and Father Chisek was sent back to the United States.
Secular or religious, ideological or politically naive, all fell victim to a heartless regime that continued on for years during the Cold War. There is little accounting and no roll call for the Legion of the Lost in the failed and discredited Soviet Union's wretched Gulag experience. And so, the massive scale of the human suffering has almost been lost to history. But some can speak for the many departed. Arkady Berdichevsky is such a man. His saga survives over the years because of the persistence of a loving wife and the dedication of the admiring son he hardly knew. At the age of 72, John Utley embarked on a journey to discover the fate of his father, lost to the Gulag, which would lead him to the edge of the Arctic Circle. John Utley was born in Moscow in 1934. His father, Arkady Berdichevsky, was a distinguished man of affairs, a Russian diplomat and former member of the government's Arcos trade mission in London. John's mother, Frida Utley, was London-born and educated, an accomplished scholar and writer steeped in Russian economics and fired by the idealism that characterized the young British communists of the period. Her experiences are vividly set down in her memoir, The Lost Illusion.
My mother was active in the Socialist Party and was the chairman of the Socialist Party at London University. And she met my father, who was with the Russian trade delegation in Russia, and they fell in love.
On April 10th, 1936, at 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at the door of Arkady and Frida's small Moscow apartment. Russian secret police officers entered, without explanation, arrested Arkady and led him off into the interminable night. Frida and John would never see him again.
The police had been investigating his boss. My father was the what would today be called chief financial officer of a group called Promexport, was the government import-export organization. And they were investigating for some exports that should not have been done.
Arkady's arrest brought him to the infamous Lubyanka prison, where he was interrogated and finally accused of subversive Trotskyite activities and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Still holding a British passport, Frida was able to escape with her son. Back in London, she worked feverishly to free her husband, or at least give him the chance to defend himself.
So when my father was arrested, she managed to get a letter sent to Stalin, signed by George Bernard Shaw, Bertrand Russell, many of the top English leftists of the time.
Their letters to Stalin only resulted in silence. Following his mother's death, John Utley continued his quest. He later gained the help of George Krasnow, a Russian educator and early defector who petitioned the FSB, successor to the notorious KGB secret police, for documents on his behalf. The new information finally led John and George Krasnow to Komi, a desolate region in northernmost Russia, the size of France much of it sprawling within the Arctic Circle.
Так уж получилось, что Коми тогда Коми.
At the time, the Komi Republic was chosen by the Soviet government as one of the principal regions where the camps were to be located. This is first of all because it is a huge territory and sparsely settled. In the 30s, the population totaled not more than 300,000 people. And this territory is very rich in natural resources. There is timber here, there is coal, oil, natural gas here. But there are no roads and no major cities. And it was decided that the populating of the territory was to be accomplished through the work of prisoners.
To this God-forsaken extremity of the imagination, the remote city of Ukhtar, John Utley unearthed the raw details of his father's bitter fate.
I am Evgenia Zelenskaya, the chair of the Ukhta-Pechorsk organization, Memorial. We are here in the city of Ukhta. This is where the Gulag began. From here, scores of prisoners were sent to Vorkuta, to Unta, to the Vevosha region. The center of it all was here until 1938. The history of our city could not have happened without the labor of the prisoners. The prisoners created all of the industry of the city, in our region, in our republic. Since 2001, John Utley is the only American who came here and searched for his father.
This is the building where I was given the file of my father. They showed me the card, a 5x7 card showing his history in the camps and finally transfer to the 3rd Department, which was a euphemism for execution in Russia.
John, я хочу вам показать.
John, I would like to show you the 7th volume published by us. These are the lists of prisoners of the camps from Stalin's time, and among them you will find a familiar surname, Bedroshevsky, Arkady Yakovlevich, a prisoner of the Ukhta-Pechorsk camp of the NKVD. Your father was executed by firing squad on the 30th of March, 1938 in Vorkuta.
And so it was that John Basil Utley was finally able to close the book on his father, a senseless victim of Gulag atrocity some 70 years earlier. On that day, hundreds upon hundreds, alleged enemies of the state, were executed, with the sounds of gunfire reverberating in the relentless cold. The new Russia will have to deal with confronting the ghosts of its past. Those who are reluctant to do so are fiercely challenged by those who insist it is crucial to act now. Irina Flick from the human rights group Memorial in St. Petersburg works hard to restore the collective memory of the Russian people. Her colleagues have helped to excavate the remains of 30,000 people killed in the Stalinist purges.
There is a legacy of the Gulag, but there is no memory of the Gulag in the national consciousness. This paradox informs the current problem with society's dialogue with the past. The Soviet terror, which accompanied almost the entire history of the 20th century, was directed toward the destruction of people and the erasure of the memory of people.
The forces brought to bear in that mad endeavor were awesome. But in the end, they failed, because memory resisted.
This memory was preserved for years, for decades. This memory was realized in manuscripts written for the drawer, in the miracle of preserved photographs. This memory was personal. This was memory without a voice, a whisper. Such a secret memory was the basic form of resistance to the terror.
And when the terror eased, gradually in the 1960s and 1970s, and then finally passed with the collapse of the old communist order in the late 1980s, new hope emerged from the ashes. What resulted is a citizen crusade called Memorial.
The memorial is a movement which appeared among those repressed, and those who knew about it, and those who sympathize. Their goal was to preserve and to transmit to future generations the memory of those events, of those people.
Memorial Society was created in the Gorbachev years. Andrei Sakharov, while he was still alive, was its first honorary chairman. So it was meant to be both a research institution and to create branches throughout the country where survivors of the Gulag could meet, could collect their testimonies, and they had in mind to create monuments.
In October, citizens annually recall the victims at the Sovoletsky Stone in front of the Lubyanka prison, with Memorial in the front ranks. Memorial was to become the champion of human rights in the new order. Its first objective was to connect the old with the new, thus preserving the memory of those who had so long endured the terror in a moving triumph of the human spirit.
I feel responsibility for the connection. Much was suffered. I can imagine how those people walked and how they were mocked. And now I don't want that connection to be broken. People must know. People must bring closure to all that happened here.
As part of the new educational mandate of the Liberals, the Perm 36 labor camp stands as one of the few surviving mementos of the Gulag era. Viktor Shmirov recounts the abuses of human rights via the history of Perm.
In the history of the camp, there were 3 periods. The Gulag period, the period of the zone for convicted workers of the security organs, and its time as a political camp. Perm 36 was a political camp. As for the generation that's growing up now, it's not that they don't have information about this history. The books aren't forbidden. Be my guest, read the books. They're in the library. But this reading is in no way encouraged. In the history textbooks, the word Gulag, in the most recent textbook, was mentioned twice. Therefore, children simply don't have the knowledge. But when they end up here, when they spend time here, the high school students always experience exactly that feeling. They feel ashamed, and it causes them pain that this happened. In Germany also, a new generation came of age and admitted the criminality of Nazism.
The Gulag itself, even though there are heroic groups like Memorial and others that are doing their best to keep alive memories of what happened then, there are also many, including some in Putin's entourage and in the government that succeeded Putin, who want to do their best to whitewash that or airbrush it from Soviet history.
With the new liberalism of Glasnost came a moral cleansing which inevitably sparked unsettling questions about the past, then unrest, and ultimately fear. All liberal causes swiftly were discredited. The reformers and dissidents had drifted too far out in front of the great mass of the Russian body politic, which has always moved very slowly.
They weren't comfortable with that kind of thing. Too much uncertainty, too much chaos, too much unruliness, too much disorder. And then again, well, okay, we've got to tighten up the ship. We can't have people on the extremes. We've got to conform and behave. And if anybody who's making too much noise, who's making too many waves, we have to put them in their place. Under Gorbachev, the latter half of Gorbachev, the society began to unravel. Under Yeltsin, it unraveled. And it opened the door for somebody to come along and say, we're going to restore order, and that's where Putin, of course, excels.
In retrospect, now Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, the rugged, iron-willed ex-KGB man, seems to have been born for a major role in Russian politics. Even if, briefly, the American president warmly proclaimed him to be a man the West can do business with. That was never where Putin's heart was.
Putin wants very much to restore Russia's role as a superpower. I've heard him speak about this several times, and there is a sense that nobody paid attention to us before. And we were a superpower. It was our great disgrace, our humiliation, that we lost that status when the Soviet Union fell apart. And we want to build that up again.
In building it up again, one has to gloss over the past.
After Vladimir Putin came to power, there has been a steady, not full-scale rehabilitation of Stalin, but certainly a revival of many official favorable references to Stalin. In addition, the Communist Party in Russia has always admired Stalin and has never made any pretense otherwise. It has remained unabashedly admiring of Stalin.
Russia has changed. It is a different country. It is richer for its oil supply and steeped in consumer options to please a stronger middle class. More financially stable and more secure than she's ever been in her entire history. Much freer and more open too, though hardly the democracy some had hoped for. The strong-armed tactics of the old days appeared neither desirable nor necessary. Yet the Russian military show of force in South Ossetia in the summer of 2008 challenges that notion.
The governor of St. Petersburg gave this incredible speech in which he said people laughed at us, disregarded what we had to say, paid no attention to us. Now we're strong again, and they have to listen to what we say, and they have to pay attention.
It seems to me that it's very, very important for the Russians to understand their past and to discuss it and to keep the discussion of it going, because if they don't, there is a danger that the past could, if not repeat itself exactly, because that's not what's going to happen, there are certainly elements of the police state that could come back again and are beginning to come back again now.
So, in effect, it became a battle of memories. The nostalgia for lost power and glory held by some against the loathing for that same regime's gruesome excesses held by others. In the end, nostalgia appears to have won. If you agitate too much or too loudly about human rights abuses, you can find yourself in deep trouble.
Today one must speak of almost open opposition and open enmity. That mild malevolence of the recent past has become open hostility, enmity on the part of the government toward Memorial.
This government enmity was displayed to chilling effect on December 4th, 2008, when elements of the security forces stormed the Memorial offices in St. Petersburg. In a raid lasting 7 hours, these masked officers cut the phone lines and seized computers and archival materials. Russia today is at the crossroads, and Memorial has helped significantly in pointing out directions. As for the guilty, however, those who were the merchants of the terror, the heartless abusers of human rights, are still around in significant numbers, yet they walk freely.
As for punishment, there is no one to punish. The entire government is made up of those very people. They aren't going to punish themselves. There is no one to punish.
I don't think that Putin's government, I don't know about Medvedev, but Putin's government doesn't think there is a problem with human rights, because he truly believes, like a lot of despots, in fact, that whatever they do for the good of the nation, and they are the only ones who know what the good of the nation is.
Russia will bear on. She always has. But some wonder how this nation can manage all the inherent contradictions she tolerates with that lingering stoicism shaped by her painful history. Might, in the end, the illusion fail to suppress the reality?
I can't understand how you can live next door to somebody who may have denounced you and then come back and then just go about life without some kind of resentment, without some kind of punishment, without some kind of retribution. Almost every family had some relative or some acquaintance who had been imprisoned or sent to a gulag or executed. So it wasn't exactly that it was a big secret that nobody knew about it. And how people could live with this kind of thing is something that I just cannot understand.
And yet they can, and do. Russians evoke and discard what has been often called the unmanageable past for the sake of the future. Yet they can be comfortable with their somber history. Vigilance and a moral conscience, provided by human rights groups like Memorial, may eventually thaw out the iced-over memories. In 2003, at the 50th anniversary of Stalin's death, Anne Applebaum wrote about the need to uncover the truth about the Gulag.
We need to know why, and each story, each memoir, each document is a piece of the puzzle. Without them, we will wake up one day and realize that we do not know who we are.